When everything feels urgent, nothing feels understandable. You scroll, you read, you listen, and somehow you're more confused than when you started. You're not uninformed. You're overexposed to narratives without context, conflict without clarity, and conversations designed to make you choose a side before you even understand the issue. This show isn't about telling you what to think. It's about slowing down the noise just long enough to ask better questions. I'm Quiver-Arnold, and this is Context, Not Chaos. By now, you've probably heard some version of the phrase, people just don't trust science anymore. But that framing misses something important. You see, most people trust science as a process, but what they struggle with is trusting the systems that communicate, fund, translate, and enforce it. And when trust breaks down at that level, evidence alone doesn't land as clarity. It lands as pressure. Today, we're talking about trust not as a personality trait or even political stance, but as a relationship. Because public understanding doesn't collapse when facts disappear. It collapses when trust erodes. Let's slow this down. Trust is the filter that information passes through before it ever reaches understanding. Long before someone asks, "Is this accurate?" they oftentimes, without realizing, ask, "Do I trust who's telling me this?" And that question is shaped by several things: past experiences, consistency over time, transparency, and whether someone feels seen or dismissed. When trust is present, uncertainty feels almost manageable. But when trust is absent, even clear information feels suspect. That's why repeating facts louder rarely changes minds, because trust doesn't grow through volume, it grows through relationship. Trust erosion didn't come from nowhere, right? Over time, many institutions communicated science as certainty, not because science is certain, but because uncertainty felt risky to admit. Guidance shifted without explanation. Nuance got lost in the headlines, and political incentives blurred expert boundaries. And for people watching from the outside, this didn't look like learning. It looked like contradiction. And when institutions don't explain why guidance changes, people fill in the gaps themselves. And oftentimes, it's with suspicion. That doesn't make them anti-science. It makes them human. To better understand how trust functions at the institutional level, I spoke with communication researcher and psychologist Dr. Nora Stefani, whose work sits at the intersection of communication, gender, and media analysis. Now, we spoke about things like what institutions oftentimes misunderstand about trust, and how concepts like beautyism and fan fiction culture play a key role in understanding the difference between trust and credibility. Here's part of that conversation. To begin, I want to thank you, Nora, because you are someone who initially, when I started the project, and I've said this with one other individual as well who I interviewed, but I am fascinated with your research, not only in beautyism, but also gender studies, overall, like feminist theory and interpersonal communication too.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, Nora, my first question for you, as a scholar of communication, how would you define trust in the context of public discourse? Because I think if we're going to have this conversation, right, we have to understand what it is.
To validate your question, when I was a young psych student, I have degrees in psych and communication.
Yeah.
When I was taking my first psychometrics class, where we're looking at how to ask survey questions, the example the professor gave was, how would you define trust? That was the first question he asked to get us thinking about how we define terms. I actually don't know what definitions of trust are common in the research. What I'm
Mhm.
thinking about for our discussion today is not just like there's a cognitive appraisal aspect where you go, I think that this information is valid, but I think of trust also as involving a relational aspect where you go, I don't expect perfection from this other person, but I think that our intentions are similar. I think that our motives are similar. I think that they don't have any ill intent.
And so when we talk about trust in institutions in particular, whether it's media, government, or even academia, right? Many people often feel it's eroding over time. From your perspective, I'm curious to know what actually is happening underneath that shift when we go from trust in institutions to maybe eroded trust.
Yeah. What I've seen a lot, even in my personal life, because I do have a lot of people who are close to me who are very opposed to or mistrustful of, like, for example, modern medicine or like research related to evolution or archaeology, things like that. And what I think I'm seeing is people have a lot of frustrations and concerns that they feel these institutions don't represent or address. And so there's the mistrust that you might see in like health institutions where it's, I keep going to the doctor and they keep telling me that, my symptoms are in my head or something. Therefore, the entire institution, because it's become inaccessible to me, feels corrupt, feels like something I can't trust. So I'm going to look elsewhere.
Yeah.
It can become very easy to say, I have all of this knowledge, and if you don't, you're stupid, or if you don't agree, then you are stupid. And even that's such a part of how we often talk and debate and have arguments about what's going on and facts and all of that, that even if somebody isn't trying to insinuate that you are misinformed or stupid, that may be the underlying assumption.
And so the title of this episode, as you're aware, suggests that transparency almost matters more than certainty, right? And so I guess I'm curious, why do you think people oftentimes confuse the two?
Yeah, in the United States in particular, and research suggests that in Western culture in general, we're really intolerant of uncertainty. And this comes up in a lot of ways. For example, there's been studies showing that people will articulate in America compared to some other places. They'll say, I have a really strong opinion on a topic, even if they also say, I don't know much about that topic. And so what people have speculated is that there's a lot of pressure to be certain. It feels like you need to have the answers and you need to have answers that align with your values. And part of your identity is being on one side or another of a debate. And so the information itself is less important than having that certainty because that's part of who you are and how you're seen by other people, and it informs how they interact with you. And when you kind of separate the information that people are making decisions about from the social ramifications of it, I think that kind of sets that spiral in motion. It becomes, and I think I see this across the board, a lot of people doing identity work with their opinions. And then it can become an us versus them thing, or like a sports team where it's your side against this other side. And so certainty makes you feel like you have the connection to your in-group. You're all on the same page. You have the correct values. You lack the failings, the personality failings that the other side has, and you need to defeat the other side.
And I feel like that also is evident in the clickbait culture that's so popular right now, just the need to be certain as opposed to informed.
Yes. And it can feel like you're doing something wrong if you say, there's a really important issue that I care about and I don't know what I think.
And so, is it possible that maybe the demand for certainty has almost undermined credibility?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, I've heard critiques again from people close to me who are very suspicious to the point of being conspiratorial about
Mhm.
science. And they will say things like, this particular finding of one study turned out to be a hoax, turned out to be fabricated. Therefore, we cannot trust in science. And my response to that is it's usually other scientists who identified that there was a hoax or some misinformation because science as a process is self-correcting.
Yeah.
So there are mechanisms that help us to double check ourselves, that help us to have pluralism and differences of opinion and share those in different ways. And those practices need to be, I think, like embedded in the identities of institutions to work. And if, you start having people who are maybe making funding decisions based on biases and not the actual data, that undermines again that sense that there is a process. And if people aren't aware that there is a process wherein you can have double checking and fact checking and change, then when somebody messes up, it feels like we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. All of science is now not reputable.
Yeah. And so, on that topic of credibility, what does it look like in practice, right? Not as just a buzzword, but as something people can recognize.
That is a really good question. To me, things that I look for when I'm kind of assessing credibility are being able to have like a transparency, like we've been talking about,
Right.
with stuff like if there's been a retraction or something has been changed in a piece, both because I want to be able to know what changes have been made, but also because of the ethos that reveals to me of
Mhm.
like we are accountable to our audience and we're not ashamed of mistakes. We publish them and make sure that the audience is informed about them. Sometimes there's a little bit of a struggle where you don't want to over professionalize everything and say, like, you can't give an opinion on somebody's behavior unless you are a licensed psychologist in the state in which I am in, that might be going too far. However, having some sort of transparency and understanding about what somebody's expertise are and what that means for the information they're giving is really helpful. For example, on YouTube, I know that there are a lot of people who are professional psychologists and therapists who give a lot of information about different disorders and therapy things that are outside of what their training area is. So
Mhm.
maybe they're a family therapist and they're making videos about people with like, I don't know, antisocial personality disorder, and that's
Yeah.
not what their training is in. Those things don't, to me, demonstrate credibility. You have some expertise, maybe you sound very professional and very confident, but you're not really taking the scope of what information you have access to into account.
Yeah. And so your academic background, right, bridges psychology and communication, I would argue. And
Yes.
so my question for you is really, how does psychology help us understand maybe why people decide someone or something is credible?
I think of it a lot in terms of identity work. And that may be, there are other things at play as well. There's been a lot of research on how people feel when they are encountering uncertainty,
Hmm.
how people feel when somebody's disagreeing with them. So those kinds of emotional responses and how that maybe biases you towards or against accepting somebody's credibility. But the thing that I tend to focus on, and that I see with my students even, is a lot of times as we're assessing credibility, it has to do again with I am the sort of person who really cares about science or really
Hmm.
cares about social justice or, et cetera, et cetera. And so how we consume information, how we interpret it, how we respond to our own feelings and interact with it, a lot of it is about this question of what would somebody who has, my allegiances, my values do?
Yeah.
And it can be really difficult to accept information that puts you in the position of feeling like you're arguing against your own side. So to give a personal example, I am a big proponent of alternatives to policing. I think that there are a lot of really cool ideas that people have come up with that are merit some further investigation.
Yeah.
I have, however, read a newspaper article that was arguing against alternatives to policing, specifically around homelessness. And
Mhm.
they were interviewing people saying that some unhoused people had argued that sometimes getting arrested helped them kind of feel motivated to get off of the streets, essentially. I didn't agree with everything that was in this article. I felt that there was bias in, for example, who they were interviewing. I
Mhm.
felt they left out a lot of context. However, there was still a whole group of people's experiences that even if I didn't think it was how what we should act on, it was still important to know it was still their legitimate experience and their concerns. And at first when I saw this article, I wanted to just ignore it and be like, this person's personal experience, they must, it doesn't count. Maybe they were confused about what happened to them. You want to dismiss it.
Yeah.
It was from a newspaper that I trusted as much as I trust any newspaper, but one that I thought was reputable. But uh, it took me, I had to take a day to kind of sit with those feelings and be like, it is okay for me to explore counter perspectives and listen to the opinions of people that I disagree with without undermining their own perceptions.
Yeah. And I think a lot about too, when it comes to understanding cultures and subcultures, right, and what's important to them, I also have heard that same argument that um, it can sometimes be beneficial to put unhoused or unsheltered people in jail for a night or however long. And I've also heard stories that some individuals from that community oftentimes will go out of their way to get arrested so they have somewhere warm, especially in colder climates, right? Have
Mhm.
somewhere warm or a place to sleep. It is almost this internal, not so much dissonance, but kind of argument like, okay, on one hand, maybe it is beneficial for them, but on the other, I don't think it's right. And so when it comes to not so much establishing credibility, but going back to trust, how do you find trust or recognize it in institutions that you maybe internally have a disagreement with, but it could potentially benefit a certain group or individuals?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when I am getting angry at somebody
Hmm.
because we have different opinions,
Yeah.
uh, a lot of times what I find is that we have the same underlying goal, but different ideas about how to get there. So
Hmm.
maybe there's some institute that's arguing against, you know, decriminalizing certain aspects of homelessness. And I hear these people making their arguments and I'm getting kind of feisty about it. How I'd have a conversation with them is it sounds like we both care about what happens to unhoused people. And that is something that is meaningful. It is not just a pithy thing to say to bring down the tone of a conversation. It is a way of connecting with other people, even if they have a different opinion. There are some people, of course, and some groups, of course, where it's never going to be safe to connect with them. Obviously, for example, a hate group is not a group that I'm
Yeah.
going to, feel comfortable associating with. But when people have some underlying thing that we all want to achieve and we have different ways of going about it. I think that feeling a sense of community with those other people is like we are here to solve a problem, and we are members of the same community. So instead of your side versus my side, how can we, who both have expertise in what it is like to be in this area or, to be in the position we're in, and we both are part of a larger group that we want to be healthy and well, how can we share our combined experience and wisdom and solve that problem? That does sometimes mean that one group is right and one's wrong, and you have to hash it out, but that doesn't have to be the deepest ideological divide that could possibly exist. You can still be on the same side of we are against having people suffering.
Yeah, almost like working towards a mutual interest.
Yes.
Moving on, I had mentioned I really want to get into your work in beautyism and your understanding of it and how it pertains to perceived credibility. And so your research touches on the topic, right? And of bias-based appearance. And so how would you say physical appearance affects perceptions of credibility in media or even public communication?
Yeah, a lot of times we have a perception that, or an expectation that somebody who's really attractive is going to be viewed as dumb and an airhead, those
Mm,
kinds of stereotypes. People report believing that that's what's going to happen. And what we see in reality is that more attractive people, as rated by any number of observers, are viewed as generally as more intelligent and more socially skillful and more morally upstanding. All of these positive traits are things that we stereotype attractive people as being. And there are times when attractiveness can come at a cost, when people can be stereotyped or viewed negatively, but those are in more kind of specific circumstances. In general, the pattern is that there's a bias towards attractive people, and there's also a bias against people who are viewed as less physically attractive.
Mhm.
So there's a cost associated with looking less attractive, conventionally speaking, than average.
And where would you argue that comes from?
There is a lot of controversy in research around this, but essentially, what I would argue is the main thing, and there is some research to support this. It's called the halo effect. We see it also with humor, where if you are meeting somebody for the first time, you have very little information to go off of in order to assess them. The information that you have available to you might be something like, what do they look like? Do they make me laugh in this first interaction? Things that you can figure out about a person right away. And so, because that information is unavoidable, really, when you're meeting a person and seeing them, you're going to know how attractive they are. That does lead you to be more likely to assume that everything else about them is positive as well. This is just a cognitive bias. It doesn't have to be limited to attractiveness. We can see that sort of what I learned about you first colors the rest of my impressions later, effect in other areas. But because attractiveness is so front and center, it's a really important example of that. Another thing I would say is that media reinforces this because who do we see being smart and solving problems and being important in the media? Disproportionately, it is attractive people. So
Mhm.
we don't see a lot of respect being paid towards people who are viewed as less attractive, and that narrative of the person who deserves to be the protagonist in this thriller movie is going to be somebody who's really good looking most of the time. Those things contribute to that stereotype as well.
My bread and butter is romantic and intimate relationships in terms of interpersonal communication. And I think a lot about how oftentimes when we're first meeting someone, like you said, we only have a set amount of things that we can focus on, right? Whether it's looks, stature, gestures, things like that. I oftentimes think about if someone's really funny and they can make us laugh, right? Oftentimes that's like a quick, like, oh, I think I like this person. That like is what oftentimes relates to an initial attraction. Would you relate that to the halo effect as well?
Yes, and the research also, a lot of times, the things I see most talked about in Halo effect are humor and beauty. There are
Hmm.
some other things that have been studied in that as well, but definitely those two.
And so, are people more likely to trust communicators, whether it's on a public scale, a social scale, or even media scale, who fit certain cultural ideals of attractiveness or even professionalism?
Yes. So we've seen this with things like persuasiveness and trust.
Hmm.
There are some circumstances, again, for example, if somebody's being accused of manipulating others, then attractiveness may be viewed negatively because of this idea that they're using their attractiveness to manipulate.
Yeah.
But for by and large, research suggests that we do tend to be more trusting and more persuaded by, more influenced by people that we see as attractive. And so a lot of times politicians put a lot of effort into making sure, even if they're not going to be seen as like a supermodel, trying to maximize what they have. And then in professional settings, women in particular report really feeling pressured to wear makeup and do certain kinds of grooming things in order to be seen as professional, to the point that makeup has even been kind of distanced from the idea of beauty. A lot of people that I've interviewed for my research didn't even think about things like putting on makeup as being about being more attractive. They saw it as being more professional.
And so, how do those biases around beauty shape which voices get amplified and which ones get dismissed?
I see a lot of times, for example, on social media, when certain people are given a lot of prominence in maybe they're like a voice for a specific stance or discourse, like maybe they're doing a lot of stuff about mental health or that kind of thing. They become seen as an authoritative figure in this discourse. They're more likely to be successful if they're attractive.
Hmm.
People who aren't are less likely to. And I see this in activism that has nothing to do with personal appearance, but that's still what I end up seeing. For example, I've noticed this in some discourses and spaces that I'm part of that look at disability.
Mm.
A lot of the people who end up having the loudest voice, the most followers, given the most attention in those spaces are people who are conventionally attractive or even unconventionally attractive, but people are viewed as, pleasing to the eye, end up having elevated status. And I think some of that is an assumption that they must be competent and successful because of how we're stereotyping them. But some of it's also that people are just drawn to those who, by definition, are attractive. And so it may be easier to give attention to those people in this really visual, heavy, short, attention span kind of digital economy that we have.
Yeah. And so thinking about who is conventionally or even unconventionally attractive, are you saying that that's closely related to cultural beauty standards?
I would say that there's two things going on. One is that we view beauty as really important for everybody, but especially for women.
Mhm.
And so we have a lot of cultural, historically and still today, a lot of different forces that are trying to determine who gets to count as beautiful. And some people have been historically restricted from that definition. Other times people have been included. You can talk about this in terms of things like weight, body shape, race, gender presentation, all of these issues have some sort of group of people saying this is what you should look like, or this is what you should not look like. And these are socially constructed. But then there's also a discussion about, okay, once you've been deemed beautiful or not, what happens to you?
Mhm.
And we can see bias, discrimination, oppression happening with both of those things. Some people are oppressed by being artificially removed from the idea of what can count as beautiful, and people are being subjected to discrimination we see in like the workforce and so on, not being hired for a job, for example, because they're seen as less attractive.
I want to move on to feminist communication and power, that subject, but I still want to reference two scenarios we've brought up. So the first being if you're seen as beautiful, then what happens, right? Like you just mentioned. And then the second scenario we mentioned a little bit ago, talking about which voices get amplified and which ones are dismissed, right?
Mhm.
So I would argue feminist communication theory often explores how power operates through language and media. And so, my question for you around this topic is how does power influence who's then believed and who is questioned?
With respect to women, there is some sort of double-sided sword or whatever, double-edged sword at play, in that women are going to be given more attention and viewed as more intelligent, more favorably in general if they are attractive. That would therefore give them a greater power, a greater voice in a discussion. Women who are viewed as less attractive are more likely to be ridiculed and mocked. And even when people are ridiculing or arguing against a attractive woman, they will often still criticize her appearance.
Mhm.
And you can see this in, for example, political cartoons where a really good-looking female politician is drawn looking not so great by somebody who doesn't like her, that kind of behavior. So in that sense, it can maybe give some sort of advantage, or you could even view it as almost empowerment for women to be able to have that influence if they are attractive. On the other hand, because I would argue as a feminist that society still curtails women's influence, power, and credibility as a group. And so, to the extent that women have access to maybe greater influence or power or credibility if they are attractive, then there's also going to be some sort of counter to that to limit and curtail that power. And so, a lot of times that can look like um, ridiculing the woman for having come by her attractiveness not honestly. So maybe
Mhm.
people saying like, oh, she has fillers or, those
Mhm.
kinds of things, criticizing her for having uh, being seen as making choices to look attractive.
I want to synthesize this for anyone who's listening. So it seems like what you're saying is that women and or marginalized communicators in general are often held to different standards when it comes to credibility. But would you argue that's the same case for certainty?
Yes. So there is research looking at what makes us perceive somebody as confident, and it suggests that we're not very good at really assessing how accurate somebody's information is, we are disproportionately swayed by confidence, and we do see bias play a role in that. For example, a lot of times, I don't know if I've seen a study looking at this, but just anecdotally, I can think of instances where I've seen people refer to Asian men as having, like, a specific Asian man is like, oh, he's more shy when he's not. And
Yeah.
so a racial stereotype there is making somebody not recognize this man's confidence. Or I've had students tell me that I'm timid and things like that. I've been told by professionals that I'm quiet when I was a student in class, and I was not. And I think that some of these expectations that, oh, I must be shy and quiet and all of this, it flew in the face of how I actually ever act. I'm very noisy and confident, but I think because I come off as very conventionally feminine that I was read that way.
Mhm. Excuse me. And so, how would you say transparency can challenge the equal or maybe unequal standards that are in place when it comes to beauty, specifically with women?
I think that being able to humanize yourself goes a long way. And when you are
Mhm.
transparent, you are a human. And when you are seen as being like defensive or putting up a front, I have to be, maybe you're very aggressive or dominant because you're trying to convey power and credibility so that you aren't undermined.
Yeah.
That can lead to the sense of you being seen as not trustworthy because people think that you're hiding something or that you're fake. Being honest, though, I think transparency is great. I value transparency a lot and I practice it. It does have a potential cost that you sign up for when you choose to be transparent. And that is that sometimes people will, in fact, react negatively to what you're being transparent about. Sometimes people will see authenticity and openness and vulnerability as a sign of weakness. And I want to live in a world where those things are valued more and not viewed as negative. And so that's what I try to practice, but being aware of when we're doing that.
Yeah, I almost relate it to that idea around like an infantilized individual, specifically relating to uh, gender imbalance or maybe even power dynamics between men and women. I don't know if you have seen this across the board, but I know I've read certain studies where men who are in positions of power, oftentimes when women they'll infantilize women, and then therefore when they get to the point of maybe belittling them or like you were mentioning, just speaking down to them to the point of tears, it's almost like that's the marker for them to know, okay, now I can back off.
Yeah. I feel like I don't think that people are intentionally going in with this idea of I'm going to make this person cry,
Yeah.
but it feels satisfying in some way to have, yeah, put that person in this conventionally feminine kind of space of
Mhm.
she's tearful now, she's upset, so now it's time for me to back off.
Which is ridiculous.
Yep.
Now, I know that you've also studied fan culture and fandom communities.
Hmm.
And one thing that I'm curious about is what can those communities teach us about how trust forms within groups?
Ooh, that's a very interesting question. There is a lot of turmoil right now. I think that these communities are in flux because of the way that people of different age groups are accessing the internet. So
Mhm.
one of the things I think you can do to be a trustworthy person is have life experience and perhaps have grown up a bit. And I think we can all, maybe not all of us, but I know I certainly can reflect back on my youth and all the, things that I regret and times where I was, again, maybe establishing my identity and pushing too hard to make sure that my viewpoint came across or make sure that people were treating me the way I wanted to be treated. And so that's developmentally appropriate. I think teenagers being a little bit angsty and tumultuous is normal. But on the internet, you don't know the age necessarily of the people who are participating. There's and people are anonymous, and there is a lot of contextual things that enable people to become very socially aggressive. And so there have been many well-known examples of toxic fan communities or debates, if you're familiar with things like shipping wars, where there are fights about which romantic relationships are okay to write about or not, which can get to the point of people being like doxxed and things.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
there's also a lot of issues that the community is still navigating about, for example, how do people that are straight write fan fiction that includes gay people? How do white people write fan fiction that's about people of color, etc.?
Mhm.
And a lot of times, feelings get hurt. There are choices that people have made that impacted somebody else negatively, but they didn't intend for that to happen. And there are times when they did intend for that to happen, or when they don't care that their representation may have been, in poor taste or flawed in some way. And then there's also people who maybe believe that they are the final authority on what is the good and ideal representation and that no other, viewpoint is tolerable. So it takes trust to be able to navigate as a group, as a community. What kind of representation do we want to build? How do we express discontent? Are we going to try to slam the other person and make them cry, or are we going to have a different kind of conversation? And what could that look like online? I think that we haven't figured out as an online community yet how that's going to look. And those things did happen in fandom before the internet. We did see there's been research on how fandom communities formed and splintered due to different opinion or different social dynamics, but it's accelerated and intensified online.
Yeah. And so I hadn't realized that because I don't know much about the fandom communities. I hadn't realized that things were so maybe divisive pertaining to certain characters or relationships or even just dynamics.
Yes, it can get extremely intense. I actually avoid a lot of online discourse just because I find that exhausting.
Yeah.
And some fandoms are more prone to that than others and have a reputation for that.
Oh my
But
gosh.
I think a lot of it does come down to a lot of these are teenagers. So
And so in fandom spaces, would you say that credibility often comes from maybe knowledge or authenticity rather than formal authority?
yes. And for example, one scandal that rocked the fandom world, there was somebody who, oh, this is going to sound amusing, but there is a girl who was writing fan fiction about, I think it was Hamilton,
Hmm.
where Thomas Jefferson had HIV and was gay, and there was other stuff going on. And
Oh,
people were sometimes critical of her representation for various reasons. They're saying the representation wasn't good. And she would say, well, I'm a queer Muslim immigrant with all these other like disabilities and just all of these different positionalities that enable me to, and I have HIV and I'm able to represent myself. Um, and so she talked a lot about her personal life in order and her positionality to kind of bolster that her representation was sound. And it turned out she had been lying and she did not have any of these identities. And
oh
that's not
my
the only, that
God.
was a really high profile example. She may not have been, it may not have been Hamilton fandom, but I think it was that one. There are other cases as well where that's happened. And then conversely, there are cases where somebody who is like does truly have positionality in a community is being forced to like give us the receipts, or we're going to define if you count as, black or not. We're going to decide, and lots of not, lots of some of the more simplistic aspects of identity politics can come up when we're thinking about credibility and authority in those spaces because it becomes who has the credibility, who has the authority to tell certain stories and to
Which
decide and
seems,
critique representation.
yeah, it seems like a whole other can of worms, aside from the fact that we're portraying a former po huge political figure, right, as someone
Yes. And I
completely
should
alternate.
add, although there is a lot of, things we can critique and negative spaces, it's also so cool to see all the opportunities that arise from that because people
Yeah.
do get to have conversations that are so much more in depth and thoughtful than I was ever encountering at their age. Thinking about all of these issues and people can represent themselves in new and exciting ways. So there's a lot of area for people to write role models who are the ones who are going on the adventures and being the hero and having that credibility and authority who aren't the standard Hollywood, hero.
Yeah, which I think must be incredibly, if not rewarding, reaffirming in my own identity, right? If I'm an individual who's from a marginalized community or historically marginalized demographic, I can't imagine what it must be like to be able to create a world where someone who looks like me is doing exactly what others have done, but just from other communities.
I have, and I'm very open about this, I have ADHD. I was diagnosed as a kid, and I struggle with a lot of the symptoms
Mhm.
and always have. And so I've always have the self-image of, oh, I'm always making these mistakes and I have a bad work ethic. That's another thing I often have thought about myself. And I grew up also being obsessed with Star Trek. And Star Trek is a show where they have these like, elite, crazy good scientists who can work for 48 hours straight to solve the problem, and they do it perfectly, and they can do math off the top of their head, and they don't make mistakes, and they're like the best of the best of the best. And those are the heroes I looked up to. And I loved watching those heroes. I've heard the phrase competence porn being used to describe this,
Mhm.
where there's enjoyment and fulfillment that's come from watching characters be very competent. And so Star Trek offers a lot of that. But I've found through fan fiction that it's really like healing and enjoyable for me to write stories that bring neurodiversity into those, amazing Starfleet officers and looking at
Yeah.
how somebody could be good at their job, but also have ADHD or be autistic. And so finding characters who embody some of those traits and then writing a story, kind of digging into that deeper and thinking about the real implications of being neurodiverse, is another way that I really explore those issues.
And that's something I hadn't mentioned, but I do know you work a lot with inclusive pedagogy, and so I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really, really good point. And one thing to round up this topic of fandom and how it relates to maybe trust, but also competence or even just credibility. What would you say institutions can learn from specific fandom groups or communities when it comes to not only establishing credibility, but also maintaining trust?
Institutions. I think that a lot of fandom is about authenticity. It is the most self-indulgent type of writing that there is. And I say that not as a negative, that's the point of it.
Yeah.
And so that earnestness that is at the heart and soul of fandom, what makes it cringy for so many people, is, I think, what we need more of in society. There is nothing more earnest and heartfelt, and it's also an avenue where people take something that is self-indulgent and direct it towards things that are beneficial, direct it towards working through mental health issues, connecting with other people, improving media representations, trying to solve social problems, and finding ways to make things fun and inspiring is, I think, what institutions can take away from it. Not to go too off track, but heard a lot of discourse lately about the new movie Project Hail Mary, which has a lot of optimism, and it's a sci-fi movie based on a sci-fi book about people collaborating, and it's very heartwarming. I loved it. And there's a hunger for that idea of we're not going to meet strangers out in space and then blast them with our lasers, but we're going to enjoy our time together. I think that that has to be at the heart of institutions, just like it is at the heart of fandom. Something that I'm still working on, I'm not great at this, but I'm always practicing it, is equanimity. If you're familiar
Mhm.
with Stoicism, same kind of idea.
Yeah.
Being able to have an uncomfortable emotion and sit with it, acknowledge it, and not run away from it. Being able to read a news story where you're going like, this person is saying something I'm not sure about, and I want to look it up. Or I think this is biased, or this is just really upsetting. Being able to have those feelings that arise from those experiences and accept them rather than avoid them is, I think, what helps you maintain skepticism and avoid cynicism.
Wow. Thank you for that. To summarize in a way, if I'm understanding correctly, for anyone who's listening, it almost sounds like what you're saying is that a healthy communication environment would look like one where transparency is almost valued over certainty. Would you agree with that?
I would, yes.
And so, if you could change one thing about today's society, right, our current landscape, and the way they think about credibility and trust, what would it be?
I would like us to think more about credibility and trust in terms of community rather than just individual
Hmm.
psychology and, picking your sports team. Thinking about how building and accepting trusting relationships, regardless of people's stance or opinion or the information that they're bringing to the table, can be something that feels good instead of something that makes you question your identity. Obviously, there are limits to this, of course, but I think that in general, this is something we could do more of.
Yeah. My final question for you is for anyone listening, right, who is trying to make sense of today's information landscape, what is the most important question they should ask themselves when they're in the process of evaluating a claim or a social post or an argument?
What I often find I get a benefit from is being aware of my biases, not in a I shouldn't have any biases kind of way. I like some of my biases. I think some of them are pretty solid. But being aware of them helps me to recognize when maybe I'm downplaying certain information or putting too much stock in something just because it fits my narrative. It's
Mhm.
not wrong to have a narrative, but you do want to feel like you have choices to make about how you're going to react to information. And you want to be able to know what your patterns are so you can make a choice instead of having that choice made for you by your gut reactions.
Well, Nora, I want to say thank you again for agreeing to have this conversation and also just being so open with us. I really enjoyed what we've talked about. And I think you've opened my perspective more to include things like fandom communities or even fan fiction writers and how those roles that are within that community play and can be replicated in larger society.
Absolutely. I've had so much fun talking with you too.
Well, thank you again so much. I appreciate you.
Likewise.
When trust in institutions begins to weaken, people don't stop making sense of the world, they just shift who it is they trust. Family, friends, online communities, or fandoms, familiar voices. This is where science becomes social, not in a collaborative sense, but in a tribal one. Belief turns into belonging, and disagreement starts to feel like rejection. That's why science heavy issues fracture relationships, not because people don't care about the truth, but because trust has become personal. Here's the reframe. Trust isn't built by appearing flawless. It's built by being consistent, transparent, and accountable. Admitting uncertainty doesn't weaken your credibility, explaining it strengthens it. And for individuals consuming information, a helpful question is this: what would help me trust this more? And is that about the data or the relationship behind it? That question slows reaction and restores agency. Before you log off, let's take one moment to bring this back to the human scale. Not the institution, not the expert, just one question to sit with. Today's question is this: where has distrust made understanding harder than it needed to be? Notice what changes when trust becomes part of the conversation instead of an afterthought. I'm Quiver-Arnold. This has been Context, Not Chaos, and we'll pick this back up next time.